Thank you all for joining us at today's Freedom of Information Foundation Luncheon. My name is Ian Mitra. I'm the president of the Freedom of Information of Texas Foundation of Texas Board. For those who've already been with us through the first half of the day, you've heard about the foundation's mission, defending open government and First Amendment rights. That work is as important now as it's ever been, and we thank you for being part of our day today. I'd like to start off by acknowledging some special guests who are here at today's luncheon or will be here throughout the day at our conference. Judge Robert Pittman, the Honorable Judge Lee Yackel, Judge Karen Crump, U.S. Representative Chip Roy, State Senator Joan Huffman, State Senator Sarah Eckhart, State Representative John Busey, State Representative Cheryl Cole, State Representative Vicki Goodwin, Judge Jan Soifer, Judge Maya Guerra Gamble, Judge Amy Meacham. Thank you all for being here. A note about who we honor through the FOI Awards, which we will be announcing now. We honor the vision of those who helped build this organization nearly 50 years ago, including the late Ralph Langer. Ralph, who's a past president of this foundation, was a driving force in making FOIFT a leader on transparency in Texas. Thanks to the generosity of his wife, Kathy Langer, we now award the Ralph Langer Scholarship, a $6,000 scholarship for journalism students. This year's recipient is Athena Singh of UT Austin. Now, Athena couldn't be here today, but we're thrilled to have students from UT Austin and Texas State in attendance. Where are they? Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks for being here. All right. We also honor the late Joel White, another past president, through a scholarship for law students in Texas. Information on both of these scholarships is available at foift.org. Now it's my privilege to present the Spirit of FOI Awards, which recognize outstanding journalism that uses transparency laws, our state's transparency laws, to serve the public. In the Class A category, the winner is the Odessa American for The Squad. The judge said about the Odessa American's work, they used public records to produce a series of well-written editorials and reports, putting the spotlight on the questionable politics and ethics of a group who controlled city government until voters unseated them in November. It's the type of unflinching coverage that takes courage and persistence and uses facts to uncover the truth. Congratulations to the Odessa American. In the Class 2A larger market category, the judge noted that multiple entries were incredibly strong and two honorable mentions stood out. KXAN is recognized for its reporting on changes to state truancy laws. By showing how little information the state now requires to track truancy cases, KXAN revealed that it's nearly impossible to measure whether the law is working. Congratulations to KXAN, which I think is represented here. Also recognized with an honorable mention is the Texas Newsroom. Is recognized for uncovering Attorney General Ken Paxton's failure to disclose personal properties he has acquired in recent years. Using public records, their reporting revealed how a top state official neglected to follow basic disclosure rules designed to ensure accountability and transparency in government. Congratulations to the Texas Newsroom. And the winner in Class AA is K-View and the American Statesman for Secret Home Security. If they could come up forward, please. The judge said of the entry, this investigative collaboration spotlighted the secretive decision by Travis County officials to spend public money to benefit one public official. The reporting led to the release of records, held government officials accountable, and serves as an example of how a strong free press should operate. Congratulations to K-View and the Statesman. All right, we are on to the James Madison Award, which the FOI Foundation of Texas bestows each year for outstanding achievements in open government and First Amendment rights. This year's recipient is Bill Elshire, who's his work has shaped Texas transparency laws for more than 5 decades. Now, we could talk for hours about the impact that Bill has had on transparency and open government. In fact, there are people who are specifically here to celebrate Bill and the positive impact he has had on them directly. I'm going to try to keep this tight so we can focus on hearing from the man himself, and I'm pretty sure he has some thoughts that he wants to say about the litigation exception while he's up here. But just a little bit about Bill. His open government journey began in 1973 when he helped draft the Texas Open Records Act, which is now the Texas Public Information Act. And he played a role in the passage of the Texas Open Meetings Act that same year. Both remain cornerstones of accountability in our state. He later served as Travis County judge for 12 years, ensuring that the Commissioner's Court operated under those very transparency laws. And since 2001, Bill has built a legal career focused on open government cases, generously volunteering as an FOIFT hotline attorney to advise reporters and citizens across Texas. Most recently, he's won significant victories that directly affect communities, stopping improper ballot measures in Austin, blocking misuse of the tax code for waterfront development, and challenging Hays County's failure to disclose details of a $439 million road bond election. We'd like to just quickly recognize FOIFT board member Joe Larson, who has worked with Bill on many open government issues and nominated him for this award. Bill's career is a reminder that open government isn't an abstract principle. It's a fight that protects the rights of Texans every day. For his lifetime of dedication and his continued service, it is our great pleasure to present the 2025 James Madison Award to Bill Elshire.
Well, I sincerely thank you for this recognition of my devotion to government transparency, but there are also very many people, including in this room, who are in that battle with us all the time. And I want to tell you all how much, especially with the FOIFT, how thankful I am for the work y'all do for transparency. Over the last week or so, I've seen some very kind and perhaps overly generous things said about me, far better than when my dear friend Ken Oden described me as a rolling ball of butcher blades. I've been accused of giving everybody hell, left, right, Democrat, Republican, but I take Harry Truman's position. I just tell the truth and they think it's hell. As an attorney, I've been blessed to have clients that would trust me to handle their cases and aimed at making public officials obey their oath of office. I joke that sometimes my clients and I probe government where the sun don't shine, but it should. We know that transparency is the ingredient in any democracy that, if missing, means we don't really have a democracy, that the people are not actually in control because they can't see inside the government. A government without transparency is just a petri dish for corruption. and can never be a government admired or respected by the people it is supposed to serve. Our democracy is wounded every time we fail to enforce our transparency laws or to get our laws fixed in the legislative process when courts find cracks in what we thought was a foundation for transparency. I stand here today more worried about a lack of freedom of information than ever before. Our laws need to be strengthened, and we all must continue to fight with all our resources to keep sunshine reaching into every nook and cranny of every level of our government. Now, y'all have a little program, and it has a picture of the Capitol on it that I asked Kelly to include so you could understand this little story I'm going to tell you. I was laying prone in the dentist chair a couple of weeks ago and looking up at the ceiling, and my dentist puts pictures up on the ceiling so you're not just looking at a blank wall, and this was there. And I had plenty of time to study it, and I noticed, if you look at it closely, that the windows on the second floor, the north side of the Capitol, seem to be lit by sunshine more than the rest of the building. And that brought back a memory of when I worked in the Capitol. Those windows there are for the Legislative Reference Library. And I used to go in there quite a bit when I worked for State Representative Lane Denton back in 1973. He was the chair of the House Committee on Human Service Agencies, and I'd go in there and review certain state agency records just to try to understand what they were up to. And I was going through minutes of the MHMR board meetings, and I noticed a budget item buried down in the minutes that said acceptance of a grant from the CIA. And we thought, what is the CIA involved with MHMR? We followed up on that series with a request for records and discovered that a study was being conducted at the Texas Research Institute of Mental Sciences in Galveston called the Psychophysiological Correlates of Human Information Processing under Altered States of Consciousness. Well, I got out the medical dictionary and started reading that report and trying to understand what it was that they were doing, and it turns out that the CIA gave MHMR a grant to study whether polygraph testing would be improved by giving the mental health patients they used in the study LSD and other drugs while polygraphing them. And our report that we ended up writing in Lane's office was turned over to U.S. Senator Frank Church's committee investigating the CIA at the time for the same kind of experimenting on soldiers. Now, my point is, this came to light. The sun shone on it because somebody read the darn minutes and followed up. They say the devil is in the detail, and that's true, but in those details we also find understanding of the whole picture. We need more people paying attention to our government. Not only what decisions are being made, but how and why those decisions are made. We've got a lot of work to do to keep secrecy and misuse of power from dominating our government. Even here in Austin, Capital Metro and Austin Transit Authority withhold records that would reveal why Project Connect is such a mess using the TPIA litigation exception, that if material is related to litigation the agency might get involved in, they can withhold those records. The litigation exception should be outright repealed by the legislature, especially now that under new discovery rules, once a lawsuit is filed, both parties have to voluntarily share all their records that are relevant to their claims or defenses with each other anyway. We've got decisions now that under the FERPA that courts have now interpreted the FERPA provision, the student records provision, the TPIA, as empowering schools and universities to themselves determine what records they have are covered by FERPA. And even if the federal law does not protect those records from disclosure, they can still withhold those records, and here's the kicker, and their decision will not be subject to judicial review. Now we find out, after all these years, 50 years, that the governor cannot be mandamused under the TPIA. If the governor complies with the Texas Public Information Act, it is voluntary. Our local district attorney is hiding records that would reveal that he restricted grand jury testimony by a police investigator in a case to obtain an indictment that might not have occurred if the investigator had been allowed to testify about the entire investigation. And just yesterday, I was contacted by a reporter who said that the Travis County clerk, and I saw it in writing, refused to provide the requester unredacted copies of personal financial statements of Travis County officials, transparency reports required by laws that we got passed when we passed the Open Meetings Act and the Open Records Act and the Campaign Finance Acts over 50 years ago. But her position was that she would not release those records unredacted unless the reporter who lives out of state showed up in person in her office to get the records. We don't always win these battles for transparency, but the fight is always worth it. I'll be there to help the people understand what our government is doing as long as I can, with the same curiosity and dogged determination as that kid did in the legislative reference library over 50 years ago, where the sun was shining in. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bill, and congratulations. I'd now like to ask Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas board member and FOI award winner Tony Plahetsky to come up to the stage and introduce our special guest speaker, Jan Crawford. Tony, yes, just really quickly, we want to note that there will be a chance to ask Jan questions, but we ask that you write them on the note cards placed on your table and then hold them up and pass them to Kelly and me so we can collect them and pass them over to Tony. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you so much. We are so excited to have such an esteemed journalist and a room full of esteemed journalists join us today. Jan Crawford, Chief Legal Correspondent for CBS News. So I first got to know Jan a little more than a decade ago when I was interviewed for one of her stories. Many of you will recall an unfolding political and legal battle between a then governor of the state of Texas and a local district attorney here in Travis County. In the years since, she has been a friend and a mentor, someone whose work I deeply admire. She's hosted me for a visit to the CBS DC Bureau, and 10 years ago was giving me sort of behind-the-scenes insight as the High Court was considering marriage equality. In addition to her role with CBS, Jan is also an attorney, an author, and a recognized authority of the U.S. Supreme Court. Her 2007 book, Supreme Conflict, The Inside Story of the Struggle for Control of the United States Supreme Court, gained critical acclaim and became an instant New York Times bestseller. Jan started covering the Supreme Court in 1994 for the Chicago Tribune and served as Supreme Court analyst for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer on PBS. She then became a law and political correspondent for all of ABC News programs before joining CBS in 2010. During this time, she's obtained rare interviews with multiple Supreme Court justices. Jan grew up on a farm in rural Alabama. I think that's one of my favorite details. Attended the University of Alabama and began her journalism career in 1987 at the Tribune, joining the Legal Affairs Beat in 1993 after graduation from the University of Chicago Law School. Her numerous awards include the Edward R. Murrow Award and an American Bar Association Civil Gavel Award as part of the CBS Evening News coverage of the landmark Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. She has been a frequent speaker about the court to colleges and universities and civic groups across the country. I want to conclude with this, and I hope she's not too mad at me for this. Earlier this year, Jan spoke at LSU, and some comments were read about her from a former colleague at CBS. Ashley reached out to that former CBS senior producer. Her name is Catherine Horn, for a copy of these comments for myself because I thought they are so pitch perfect for our guest speaker today. So I just want to end on this note. She writes, Jan is one of the most respected journalists in Washington. Her knowledge of and insight into the Supreme Court and our legal system are unparalleled. I worked with Jan for nearly a decade, and one of my favorite days was in June 2012 when the court handed down a decision on the constitutionality of Obamacare. Several correspondents rushed through the decision in a race to announce the ruling first, and they got it wrong. Not Jan. While appearing on live television, she tuned out the noise around her and the pressure to report quickly and carefully considered the opinion pages in her hand. She then looked into the camera and announced the correct ruling. It was a masterclass in the importance of delivering reporting that is accurate and complete in a media environment that so often values speed and snap judgments more. Jan has been a role model and a mentor to the journalists with whom she works and has set the standard for reporting with integrity, fairness, and humility. Please join me in welcoming Jan Crawford.
Okay, well, that was too much, Tony. I mean, that was really, I apologize if I'm very flushed right now. I feel embarrassed, honestly. Caroline was a wonderful producer, and I've been so privileged over the years to work with so many wonderful journalists, not only at CBS, but of course I'm an old newspaper reporter, and I'll forever consider myself a newspaper reporter. But Tony, that was, thank you, really embarrassing. It's really great to be here. When Tony called, I mean, of course, I would say, yes, I have an excuse to come to Austin and see Tony and Roe, and I just have to say that, man, we hit the ground running. We went straight from the airport to Matt's El Rancho, where I think I ate my weight in Bob Armstrong last night, which if you guys don't know from Austin, Bob Armstrong is a dip, a cheese dip, that has ground beef, guacamole, and sour cream. A little sour cream. Well, I ate a lot of it and a lot of chips, and it was delicious. It's always great to be in Texas. I have a real soft spot for Texas. I actually interned at the Dallas Morning News when I was in college, and I always enjoy coming back here, although I will say, when I got up this morning and went to put on the robe in my very nice hotel, this is a really nice hotel, and I love a good hotel bathrobe, I flinched because it had a big orange Longhorn logo on it. So, of course, this Alabama girl, Roll Tide, I had to, drop it. I couldn't put it on. So, other than that, it's been a great trip. And congratulations to all of the winners. Mr. Elshar, wherever you were sitting, I really enjoyed your remarks, and thank you for all that you've done here in Texas. And thank you for all of you guys, all the work that you do, and of course for having me. I thought I would just talk a little bit about my career covering the court, kind of where I see the media right now covering the court, and then we're going to open it up, like Tony said, to some questions to talk about kind of specific issues. There's a lot going on, and I'm sure you guys will have some, like I said, more specific issues. But this is now my 32nd year covering the Supreme Court, which I can't believe. I'm sure I've been covering the court longer than some of you have been born. But I left Alabama, where I grew up, the day after my graduation. Roll Tide again, and you're probably going to get a couple more Roll Tides before this is over. And I headed for Chicago, where I started a job at the world's greatest newspaper. No shade on the morning news, but that's their call letters. WGN was world's greatest newspaper, so if you guys didn't know that. And I covered crime, local politics, and then took a leave of absence for law school and went back to the Tribune, which then sent me to Washington the next year to cover the Supreme Court, and I've been there ever since. I have seen great change in 3 decades of covering the court, not only, of course, in the makeup of the court and the composition of the court, how it approaches the Constitution and the law, but also in how the media and alternative media covers the court. And I am not convinced that all of that change has been for the better. I started covering the court the year Justice Breyer joined. Like Tony said, that was 1994, and that court of 9 justices would serve together longer than any court of 9 in history, 11 years, which meant Justice Breyer was the junior justice for longer than any justice in history. And the court has this, like, everything is by rule, traditions, order of seniority. So by tradition, the junior justice, when the justices meet in their private conference after arguments to discuss cases, and they meet in this like wood-paneled room off the chambers of the Chief Justice. It's just, you can just picture how beautiful it is. It's just the 9 of them. They sit around this big wooden table, no secretaries, no law clerks. So when someone knocks on the door, if a justice needs a law book or something, the junior justice has to get up and answer the door. So Justice Breyer did that for 11 years until Justice Alito joined. And then Justice Breyer, for several more weeks, would still hop up as if by instinct to let someone in. That role now is, of course, held by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. She is our newest justice. And another fun fact about being the junior justice, you have to head up the court's cafeteria committee. So I'm not so sure that's something she really enjoys. But in that 11 years that court was together, and it was led by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, you saw some really familiar patterns then. It was a conservative court, 7 justices nominated by Republican presidents, but it was a moderate court, and in case after case, it failed to really kind of undo these sweeping rulings of the Warren Court era, which was when, the liberal icons, William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall, were on those courts. And so in case after case, with those 7 and at one point 8 justices nominated by Republican presidents, this was a court that really disappointed conservatives. It refused to overturn Roe versus Wade. It refused to end affirmative action. It really didn't really lower that wall between separation of church and state, and on and on and on. There were a bunch of reasons for that. Some of the justices weren't as liberal as some of the presidents may have hoped. Others kind of drifted to the left. But that became, like I said, a great disappointment. So when Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the court's first woman, retired in 2005, and then when Chief Justice William Rehnquist died, conservatives were determined that they were not going to repeat some of those same mistakes that they saw from what they believed from their predecessors. And that approach, that deliberate approach, of selecting the justices who have now taken some of those places, has shaped the court that we have today. Now, it marks the 20th anniversary this year, if you could, again, this is hard for me to believe too, of Chief Justice John Roberts leading the Supreme Court. And this court that we have right now is entirely different than the court that John Roberts stepped into 20 years ago, and certainly different than the court that I started covering more than 30 years ago. So what is this new Roberts Court? I thought I'd talk a little bit about that, and then we can do more specifics in the Q&A. It's 6-3, as you guys know, and it's pretty solidly conservative. But it also operates in some surprising ways. It doesn't always, and by any means, split along that 6-3 conservative liberal majority. In fact, last term, That divide only happened in 9% of the cases. It is unanimous almost half the time. But these are not, of course, the stories or the things that you hear, because in some of the most controversial cases, whether it's on abortion or affirmative action or the role of the administrative state, or what we've seen this summer in some of those emergency orders where they're allowing the Trump administration policies to continue in an interim basis while lower courts sort through the legal issues, those cases are 6-3. And I do think what we can also say with confidence about this court is that, unlike with some previous courts, this court with those 6 conservatives is not going to really change or evolve. I don't think we're going to see, like in previous courts, some of these conservatives kind of start drifting to the left. Even Justice Amy Coney Barrett, although I think there's hope among liberals, I would say don't get your hopes up. But you know, they're all different. The nominees, I mean, President Trump has 3 nominees, of course, and then George W. Bush with the 2 previous nominees in Roberts and Samuelito. And they all have very different views of approaching the law, which is why you've only seen that 6-3 split occur in 9% of the cases. Some are bolder than others, some are more cautious, some are more pragmatic. They've all, I think, departed in significant ways than what people may have expected, you know, in lockstep, unanimity when they came on board. I like to talk about how, like, a new court, and this is still a new court because Justice Jackson's, you know, relatively new, is like a Polaroid. And obviously, in my generation, we had Polaroids, and, you know, that's like, I'm sure, does everyone know what a Polaroid is? Anyway, okay. You know, it takes a while for that photograph to come into, like, sharp focus. And I think that's the kind of story of the court right now. You know, we have a general sense of what this court's going to be like, how they're going to approach some of these major issues facing the judicial system in American society, but we haven't quite got the clearest picture yet. I think right now what I can say with confidence is there are 9 very independent thinkers on the Supreme Court. They are, I think, you know, deeply experienced and all quite intellectual with very different views on the law. And they're just engaged in kind of this titanic struggle over how to interpret the Constitution and how to interpret federal statutes. And you've seen from some of the language, certainly in some of the more prominent cases, that they have very sharp disagreements. And some of the language has been quite stark. But again, that's not unusual. And if you look back over history, courts and justices have long had quite sharp differences in perspectives. Justices have come almost to blows back in the olden days. And so I think what you're seeing now is just this real struggle about the way to interpret the Constitution, the way to analyze those laws. But that's not the narrative that you increasingly see about the Supreme Court. And this is really what I want to focus on just for the last part of my remarks. When you follow news coverage of the court, if you believe everything that you read online or see on social media or see on cable news, you would assume that this Supreme Court is corrupt, that it is beholden to Donald Trump, that it's in the tank for Trump, that it's lawless. And that narrative is completely false. But it's helped contribute to an atmosphere and a decline in public confidence in the court and its legitimacy. And that is dangerous for our democracy. When I was growing up in rural Alabama, like Tony said, the closest town was called Arab. It was spelled A-R-A-B, and yeah, we in Alabama call that Arab. It was about 15 miles away. I never thought about being a journalist. I didn't know any journalists. You know, we got the weekly Arab Tribune on Thursdays, but it just never could occur to me that journalism would be a career. I thought maybe I'd be a lawyer. You know, my parents always said I like to argue, so I still kind of do. So I went to the student newspaper at the University of Alabama because I thought, I need to get some writing experience for law school. I went to a pretty rural high school, and I was behind on the little areas and writing. I thought I need to get some more experience. I got an assignment. I was so nervous and so excited, and I was immediately hooked. Like, I could not believe that there was actually a career that you could get paid to ask people questions and find out things before anyone else and then go tell people about it. Like, that just blew my mind that, like, you could get paid for that. And I still feel that way today. And don't tell CBS, though. I mean, like, I still like getting paid. But that immediately I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I ended up being editor of the student paper, and when the Chicago Tribune called and asked if I'd like a job in Chicago, I said, yes, I would like a job in Chicago. And I packed my bags the night of graduation and left Alabama. I'd never been to Chicago in my life. My dad drove my mom and dad's car in front of us, and Mom and I drove back in my car, this old beat-up Toyota Tercel. And I just remember when I saw the skyline, in the distance, and Chicago is a great world city. I mean, and that sky, you guys have a good skyline here, though, in Austin, by the way, which it's changed since I was here several years ago. I was amazed. But when I saw that skyline, I just remember, like, just feeling my heart just racing. And, it's getting closer and closer, and then it's getting further and further away. Like, my dad could not figure out, like, how to exit to get into Chicago. And we drove up somewhere north of the city, way up in some suburb that seemed a little more comfortable for my dad to be able to, like, get off on, and just stayed in a motel that night. And then I finally made it into Chicago the next day, and I stayed there for 7 years. And the way journalism, I'm not sure how newspapers here in Texas do it, but certainly when I was starting out in journalism, the way they used to do it was, you'd work the night shift for a couple years, 5 to 1, then you get a promotion to 4 to midnight, and you're covering shootings and school board meetings and fires. And then, they send you out to the suburbs, and you learn how to do a beat. So I went out to DuPage County and covered the local government there, and I just loved it. I loved everything about it, talking to cops, calling in stories from these, grimy payphones on the west side, back in the day before, believe it or not, we had no cell phones, there were no laptops, there really was something called rewrite, when you would call from this grimy payphone, and there were really old guys who smoked at their desk and had scotch in their drawer who would answer the phone and say, rewrite. And you would just tell them what happened off the top of your head as best you could, and then they would rewrite whatever your thoughts were, and that's what would be in the paper the next morning. It's different now. That's probably for the better, actually. But, after several years, I decided to go to law school. I realized that there was injustice everywhere. It wasn't just in Alabama. And I thought there were limits on what I could do as a reporter. I could cover wrongdoing, I could cover injustice, but I had to step back and let somebody else pick up the ball and try to affect change or try to rectify whatever issue there was. And I thought, maybe as a lawyer I could do both. I could, or at least better understand the law so I could explain it to others. So I went to the University of Chicago for law school. I worked my summers at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery. I worked at a firm in New York, Floyd Abrams' firm, where I did First Amendment work, and that's what I was planning to do. And just as I was heading off to that firm after graduation, after I'd taken the bar exam, I'd already spent the $5,000 signing bonus I got from my law firm, I had lunch with the editor of the Tribune. And he said, why do you want to be a lawyer? Like, all lawyers are miserable. And I was like, that did I kind of did notice that the summers I was there. And he's like, you can always be a lawyer. You've taken the bar, you can always go to law school. I mean, you can always, since you've been in law school, you can always be a lawyer. Come back to the Tribune. You've never covered the courts. You can cover the Supreme Court. And so, I thought about it. My parents were not super happy that, I had taken all this time for law school and I was just going to go back to being a reporter. But I did. I went back to the Tribune. I covered the Illinois Supreme Court and the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the very next year, the Tribune sent me to Washington to cover the U.S. Supreme Court. And I'll never feel how and I'll never forget how I felt when I saw that Supreme Court, when I walked up for the first time. It's just this majestic building, this white marble, the steps, and it just was awe-inspiring. Like, it really felt overwhelming to me at that time, and I acutely felt my sense of duty, why I was there. That was to explain these decisions in a way that people in Alabama or Illinois, or if somebody from Texas was reading the Tribune, that they could understand, and how those decisions affected their lives. I actually think this to this day, like my role as a reporter is like standing in the shoes of someone from Morgan County, Alabama, which is where I grew up. They're never going to be able to go to Washington, probably never be able to even listen to an argument from the Supreme Court, but those decisions have enormous impact that the court does on their lives. Why are those decisions important? Why do the rulings matter? And you know, these are hard cases. They've divided the lower courts, and you know, they've divided very smart judges, which I was fortunate to sit at a table of many of them. And so, you know, when I'm sitting there in that courtroom as a reporter, I'm always so curious, how is the court going to resolve this? Like, how are they going to work their way out of this issue that, again, has split these lower courts? I never think, wow, they better not get this one wrong, or wow, I hope they do that. I want to know what they're going to rule. And then it's my job to explain how that's going to affect people, what the ruling means, and what the court did. So I'm now approaching my 4th decade in journalism, 3 decades of which I've spent in the nation's capital. And I can say with complete certainty that being in Washington and being a national correspondent in Washington, it's never been as difficult to be fair and objective as it is right now. And when I explain this, I know some of you are probably just going to think that I'm old, that I don't get it, that I'm out of touch with this new world, and that extraordinary times we're in require extraordinary measures. But to them, I would say that is not journalism as I knew it, and that is not the kind of journalism that is so important. Our framers deemed a free press the First Amendment to our Constitution. I think for much of my career in Washington, reporters who covered the court always wanted to get it right. That was our focus: be fair, objective, to show good judgment, and most importantly, get it right. You know, what were the facts? And that's no longer the case. Too much today of our media coverage, I think, is driven by biases, fury over the outcome of decisions, pressure from news organizations to put forth a narrative for clicks or subscribers or views or ratings or their brands. This new media and some of the new reporters aren't as interested in getting it right anymore, which means journalism is not always what it used to be, and in my view, that is not for the better. I think in many quarters, objectivity has been replaced by activism, and that is not our role. Instead of telling all sides of the story and the facts and what happened, some journalists now will tell stories based on their biases or point of view. And I've seen that firsthand, that the media has somehow changed to enforce and further a narrative, whether it's social media, podcasts. We have these breathless stories quoting extreme voices in Congress, or so-called public interest groups. And at the court now, those stories imply scandal, corruption, but they often fall short and there's no there there. And I think these attacks without basis undermine the legitimacy of the court and the public's faith in the institution. And like I said, that is not only dangerous for democracy, it's a precarious situation for the court. I think a lot of this started in the political realm when then Leader McConnell refused to replace Justice Scalia after his death. That was angered Democrats, but they were powerless to do anything about it. So I think there is kind of a genesis in the political side of things, and the decisions that happened since by the court have kind of furthered this divide, especially Dobbs, that for I think many people, that decision meant that surely if the court was going to overturn Roe versus Wade, that would mean this court is illegitimate. Surely They're not making their decisions based on the law. Again, I reject both of those things. I mean, this is a court with very strongly held views on how to interpret the Constitution, but they have methods and ways of interpreting the Constitution. And you may disagree with them, I may disagree with them, but it is not lawless. And that's had an impact, not only on public opinion about the court, but in the overarching political climate at the court. In the wake of the Dobbs decision, protesters started showing up at justices' homes at all hours of the night. There were constant death threats to the justices and their families. Some were even told to wear bulletproof vests. Justice Barrett tells the story of how she had a bulletproof vest on her bed in her home, and one of her sons came in the bedroom, and he was like, "Oh, wow, Mom. Like, that is so cool. Like, wow, can I put it on?" When he saw it. And so he starts putting on, and then he just stops. And he says, "But wait, Mom, why do you need this?" Justice Kavanaugh and his family are lucky to be alive today. In 2022, a man flew from Washington from California, and he showed up at Justice Kavanaugh's house in the middle of the night with a bag full of weapons, including a Glock with 2 magazines of ammunition, pepper spray, zip ties, a nail gun, a crowbar, duct tape, a hunting knife, burglar's shoes, a silencer, and on and on. The man actually made his way to the back of Justice Kavanaugh's yard without being seen by security when he had second thoughts and called his sister. If she had not answered the phone, maybe she was in the shower, maybe she was in a movie, I believe that Justice Kavanaugh may well be dead today. The man later told authorities he was upset about the Dobbs decision and worried about gun control laws being rolled back further, and that he planned to kill himself after he murdered Kavanaugh. If you guys aren't familiar with all the details of that, it's because it barely got covered. It was buried in the New York Times and really not mentioned after a day or so. So I think all of this adds to this sense that there's some finger on the scale that has had an impact, I believe, on public opinion, which again is dangerous for the court. The court doesn't have standing armies where they can go and ask people to, order them to follow their rulings. They have to rely on the public's faith and confidence in the integrity of the judicial system. I wonder if Bush versus Gore was decided today, how would people respond? And I think that only shows what an awesome responsibility that we have as journalists to tell the facts. Because at what end? I mean, we're feeding a narrative. It's not having any impact on the justices and their opinions. In fact, you could argue that it's, instead of encouraging justices to change their views, it's just making them kind of, not believe anything that they're reading about the court. The reporting has just become so partisan that it has little sway. And I think now, when the media is under attack and scrutiny more than ever, we have an even greater duty to just go back to the basics, cover the facts, drop the narratives, question both sides, cover both sides equally. And until then, I would say to you, when you're reading about things that are happening in Washington, don't believe everything you read. And that's very hard for me to say. But my other message is one of thanks, because what you do here in Texas through this organization, the work that you do to promote transparency, the work you do in our major state papers and local papers, which I will always find dear to my heart as a local reporter for many years at the Chicago Tribune. That should be our example. I mean, that's what Washington media could learn from, where you talk to both sides, where you are fair, where you just follow the facts, where you want more information and more transparency so that you can inform people. You are standing in people's shoes and doing it the right way, and for that I say thank you. We have a lot we can learn from you, and thank you for listening to me today.
So while we are collecting questions, there's a question I wanted to ask. Obviously, we have a lot of journalists in the room who work in high-stakes, high-pressure situations, and I know it's changed since the pandemic. But can you talk about the anxiety and the pressure of standing in front of the Supreme Court on decision days, live on the air, a decision, interns, correct, used to run from, they get the decision, run it out to you, shove it in your hands, and within moments, you have to look at the decision and announce it to the nation, essentially.
Well, I mean, I'll crawl under the table in the fetal position, because this is my least favorite part of the job. So thanks for bringing that up.
Sorry.
No, I mean, because obviously to get it wrong, it would be mortifying. And, it's not like a criminal trial where you can, like the Martha Stewart trial, where you can, a white flag or a green flag means guilty or not guilty, or when we have a new pope, somebody will send up like smoke. I mean, these decisions could be 100 pages and, it could turn on a footnote, and you're standing there on live television trying to make sense of it. It's very high stakes, and again, I get very little sleep in June because it's very anxiety producing, and the only way that I can get through it is I just try to be as prepared as possible. I've read and reread the transcripts from oral arguments, the lower court opinions. I've tried to talk to the judges who were involved in the lower court opinions to kind of get their sense of what they think the court may do off the record. Because again, my goal is not to try to, my goal is to try to get this right and explain this in the best way I can in a very short time frame. And so that's the only way that I can get through June, is I just feel like I have to be so prepared to just have a sense of which possible outcomes could happen. And with Obamacare, that decision, which again, these were great reporters, it's high stakes, that was a really complicated ruling when the court ruled that it was going to uphold President Obama's signature achievement. It was in the back half of those papers when we got the decision that we saw that the Chief Justice was calling the individual mandate in Obamacare a tax, and so therefore it was within Congress's taxing power. But a lot of people stopped at the first part of the analysis, which got most of the attention. I had a source in the White House who told me the week or two before, don't forget about the tax issue. And so, again, just that kind of preparation, like what could they possibly do? How could they possibly decide this case? When I saw the first part of the decision, it looked like Obamacare was toast, right? And that's what several people ran with. But then I thought, wait, what about the tax issue? And so, again, but this is nothing that you guys, the reporters in the room, it's so much of it, whether you're preparing for an interview or you got to be prepared. And then you kind of have a sense of what you're talking about.
The court is famously opaque, but it has opened up in some ways. Can you just talk about the way it has become more available to the public, but also do you see kind of transparency within the court changing in the future?
No, yes and no. So the court, after COVID, one of the really interesting things, after COVID, they had to meet remotely. And so they started live streaming their arguments. So everyone can listen to them now, which is great. If you haven't done that, we're going to have some big cases this year. It's fascinating. I would really encourage you to just go to the court's website and listen to the arguments. They're very active from the bench. You can really get a sense of sometimes their questions, like where their sympathies may or may not lie, and how they play off each other and their personalities. So that, I think, has been a real positive to give people more access to the court, because most people are not going to be able to go to a Supreme Court argument. You have to be in Washington during those 6 days a month, setting in the summer when they go on recess. You have to be able to get into the court for argument. So this has been a wonderful way of opening the court up to people, because they didn't change it once COVID was over. They kept those live streams going. Is the court going to be, the court says that they are the most transparent branch. They write pages upon pages explaining their decisions and why they're making the decisions that they're making and why they disagree with the decision, if they do disagree. And we have some pretty strong disagreements. So the court and the justices, all 9 of them, would be unanimous on this, that they are transparent. But I think that because what we've seen, including the leak in the case that overturned Roe versus Wade, some other leaks that have come out of the court about their discussions during their private conference, which is sacrosanct. I mean, that's when they kind of talk about the cases, and then they work through those discussions in their writing, and they circulate different opinions and different memos. That's kind of how they do things. All of those things, I think, will make the court much less likely to maybe go out. You see some now doing speaking engagements, but it's not like it used to be. I mean, I used to moderate discussions between, Scalia and Breyer. They would, very different views of the law. I mean, Justice Scalia was obviously one of the most conservative justices. Justice Breyer was obviously one of the more liberal justices who was very good at persuading some of his conservative colleagues that maybe they should come along to the left every now and then. He was very effective on the court. And so that would be like a wonderful chance for people to come and hear these 2 justices debating, is it a living constitution or is it a dead constitution? As Justice Scalia would always say, the Constitution's dead. And I remember one time I did one of these events. They walk off the stage and Justice Scalia goes, well, Steve, should we go get a burger? And Justice Breyer was like, sure, let's go. So these 2 guys just like walk off together. Now they had a driver, but it wasn't like today. Like the security around the justices today, by necessity, is so extreme that it's really cutting back on the things that the justices can do in public. The events, they have to have mags at many of the events. It's just a different world we're in. And again, I mean, I could go on about how not all of that is good. That's not a good development.
Obviously, the overturning of Roe versus Wade has had a profound impact on our nation and really created a lot of fear about some of the rights that have been granted over generations. Someone is asking specifically about marriage equality, for example, and other kind of bedrock decisions that have shaped the way we live and work and pray in this country. To what extent, in your estimation, is there a risk that some of those defining rulings could be overturned?
I will say, I think with a pretty fair amount of confidence, that the chance that the right to same-sex marriage, the right to conception, will be overturned is 0. The court does not see those cases the same way. One justice has suggested the court should rethink them, but to do anything at the Supreme Court, you need 5. And that's not going to happen. And if you read some of the opinions, certainly even in the Dobbs opinion, but even most recently in Justice Barrett's book, she talks a lot about how the right to marriage, the right to contraception, those are very different kind of rights than a right to an abortion. Now, you could disagree with that, and I know a lot of people do, and 3 justices on the court do. But she talks about why that's different. And the principles of stare decisis, when the court is considering whether or not to overturn a case that's wrongly decided, they are also very different than, say, the right to abortion versus a right to marriage. That's a totally different analysis, because one of the key issues when the court's debating whether or not to overturn a case it believes was wrongly decided was reliance. And unlike with abortion, marriage has enormous reliance interests. People organize their lives around marriage. They have property. They have contracts they've entered into. So there are several reasons why I think this court will never overturn the right to same-sex marriage, and certainly not the right to contraception. So that's not going to. I can just say that's not going to happen. Not this court. Not this court. I mean, if you got 4 more Justice Thomases who thinks that you should rethink those rights. But even then, even if the court said you should rethink these rights because they aren't implied rights that were so obvious that the Constitution didn't have to spell them out, so, of course, they're protected by the Constitution. Even if the court said, yeah, these lower courts were like off on a trip of their, these previous courts were off on a trip of their own, then they have to go to the next thing, stare decisis. And then they have to go through those, which means let the decision stand, and whether or not, even if it's wrong, the Supreme Court has to let the decision stand. And that will be the stopgap, because those stare decisis interests for certainly the right to marriage are very different than when you're analyzing a right to an abortion.
What confidence do you have? I mean, obviously, we know that there will be tests rising from the Trump administration that will make their way to the Supreme Court. Obviously, a number of justices on the Supreme Court are Trump appointees. What confidence, and you've spoken to this some, but what confidence can American citizens have that the court is going to be insulated from the Trump presidency?
So I was really hoping that someone would ask this question, because I think this is a really disturbing trend about the narrative and the commentary that we're seeing around the court right now. I think it's, first of all, really important to point out that what the court is doing right now is issuing what's called interim orders. So, Trump has written some executive order that he he said he's going to fire someone from the FTC, or he's going to cut funding, or something on immigration. And the question is, for the court, do they preserve this status quo, because a lower court judge has blocked it, right? So then does the court, how do they react to these executive orders or decisions while that litigation is unfolding in the lower courts? And so right now, the Supreme Court has generally allowed a lot of Trump's actions to go forward while the lower courts decide whether or not the underlying merits, or whether he has the authority to do that on the underlying merits. There's a couple things that I think people are missing on that. Number one, these are not merits. Trump's going to lose some of these cases when they get back up to the court. Not all of them, but he will lose some. And number two, the Solicitor General and his office, they're actually doing really good work. Their briefs are excellent. I mean, they're very well done. And they're being very strategic. So of the 125, 150 lower court orders blocking Trump's actions and orders, they've only asked the Supreme Court to step into, it may be 20 now. It was, last week I looked at it, it was about 18, I think. So out of that, 150, they've asked for 18. And they've been successful in those, but they're only taking the ones that they believe they have a pretty high amount of confidence that they can win on this interim basis. So, but again, I mean, what it implies is, oh, here comes, and people say this, I have friends who are like, oh my God, there's the court again, siding with Trump. I think that, we have to keep in mind that this is a very small number of cases that they're even taking up and looking at right now, and those are the cases that come to them, and also that these are not the merits. There are, if they do come back to the court, when the court actually analyzes the merits, they could see that in a very different way. So I think I would just say, stay tuned and let's see what happens. But this is a court that has very strong views on executive power. I mean, there are at least 5 justices who believe that, a robust executive is how our Constitution was designed and structured. So, but they've always had that. I mean, even in the Biden administration, they, right now, Trump, a big issue that the court's going to decide this fall is, the extent to which Trump can fire members of independent federal agencies and multi-member boards, whether it's the FTC or the Consumer Product Safety Commission, on and on. And I think they're going to say, yes, Trump can do that. And why do I say that? Because before Trump was president, there was Joe Biden, who asked the Supreme Court to let him fire the Trump-appointed commissioner on the Social Security Administration, an independent federal agency. And the court allowed President Biden to fire that Social Security Administration commissioner and replace it with his own pick. So they've been signaling throughout different administrations that they believe these federal agencies are so different now than they were at the turn of the century, that they have so much power that the president actually, and they exert executive power so the president can have some say on who's going to be on those agencies. That's kind of I went way down a country road on that question. Sorry.
Just a couple of other questions, and you talked about this some, and we've talked about this, and that is the role of advocacy in journalism, and when is that appropriate? Is it appropriate, for example, for journalists to advocate on behalf of the First Amendment or for the First Amendment and press freedoms? Obviously, a tenet of journalism is afflict the comforted and comfort the afflicted. So can you just talk about your sort of professional viewpoint of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is crucial. We have to look out for the First Amendment, and what you do here in this room is crucial. What I see happening more and more, and I think social media really, people kind of they've just gotten in the habit of kind of saying what they think, or what the government should do, or what the law should be. And certainly at the Supreme Court, you see law professors who are, have a liberal point of view or a conservative point of view, and they're much more willing to say, well, this is lawless, or this is, and that I think is where, and it's fine for law professors to do it, but for the press or people on social media or cable podcasts, I think it's really dangerous. And that's where I would draw the line. That becomes advocacy. And, whatever your issue may be, it could be other issues that you really care about. But as journalists, and again, I'm preaching to the choir, you guys all know this, we can't just start being activists. It's still our job just to kind of cover the issues and cover the facts. When we see stories of great injustice, when we need greater transparency, we pursue that vigorously. But our responsibility stops there. And we have to wait by our journalism, by the work we do, for advocates and activists to take that up and then affect change.
We present the information to the public.
And we demand information, we want transparency, all of that. We vigorously question public officials, and the work that you do here, but then we don't get to advocate. That's the difference. And I see that I see that that line is getting, at the national level, in D.C., more and more out of focus.
Can feel like we're on a crusade.
Yeah. And I see that with issues that I cover specific to the cases. The court takes up some of the most controversial issues of the day, and it's not our job to advocate for the right to abortion or the right to gender-affirming care. We cover the facts, and then the advocacy groups have to do the hard work to either,
One last question, and this is, of course, something that I think a lot of people have sort of learned about in recent times. Can you just talk about the shadow docket and how can there be increased media transparency and increased visibility on the shadow docket? Again,
another question. You guys, if I were going to write, these are you're asking the most important questions, so obviously you're journalists, but so that's kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking about with the emergency applications or the interim orders. They're all the same thing. It's kind of, some people call it the shadow docket. The critics of the court call it the shadow docket. Others call it the emergency docket or the interim docket. They're all, everyone's talking about the exact same thing. It's when people are going to the court and saying, this is so urgent that we can't wait for the litigation to work its way through the process. That will take years, and we will be harmed irreparably. We can't wait that long, and ask the court to step in and either block a lower court injunction or, not. The court has been criticized by some federal judges, in fact, for not explaining some of their thinking on these orders. Like they're saying a lower court's wrong because, Trump can fire a commissioner on the FTC. I mean, but they're not really explaining why. So that's been very frustrating to lower court judges. The Supreme Court and the justices say that the reason is these aren't merits decisions. So basically, lower court judges, do the best you can. But we're not going to give it really any more guidance, because when it gets to the merits, that's when we have full briefing, that's when we have argument, that's when we actually think about these decisions, not in some 2-day rushed period. They don't want to write opinions in these cases that would freeze the court to a certain position. Because justices, argument, they can change their mind at argument. They can change their mind after they've read the briefs and had many conversations in conference. They can change their minds once they're trying to write the majority opinion. So the concern is, and the justices have said, that if they start giving more explanation, then that would freeze them in positions, and that might not be a good thing. So that's why, and I don't think that's going to change. And I think they would just say, just do the best you can, and give it a shot. Give it your best shot. Sorry, Judge.
Jan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolutely.